Our first question I'm going to put to the whole panel. So from Emeritus Professor Michael Corcoran, a new house emits 50% of its life cycle CHG before it becomes a home. We are referring, of course, to embodied carbon. Without this being considered, we're entirely missing the point, because the crucial period in its next 10 to 15 years. Should we be looking at the embodied carbon in retrofit and in new homes in respect of this issue?
I think we should. I think that the fact that our homes last a very long time, I'm sitting in one which is typical in London, and it's 120 years old. They don't last 30 years, they last a very long time. So the embodied carbon is important, but the transition to heat is very different to the question around low energy and insulation. I think that's where embodied carbon probably comes. That's just an opinion.
Similar to Andy, I do think as well we should, particularly new build, look at embodied carbon, because particularly as we hopefully going to solve the heat problem, and operational carbon is going to go in the next years. Again, hopefully lower and lower embodied carbon is going to become one of the sources that we're going to have to tackle and understand.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to move on to the next question. How does gas cooking rate as a CO2 reduction priority in the UK? That's from an anonymous attendee. Apologies.
Don't have a number in front of me, but compared to the use of gas for heating, it's a much smaller share of emissions. But of course, you know, it makes little sense if you're already moving away from gas for your heating to then keep and maintain the gas grid just to cook with gas. And in fact, you know, induction hobs are already in existence and way more efficient than a gas hob. And they are similarly responsive. So I've switched to an induction hob myself about a year and a half ago, and I have to say they work just as well as a gas hob. So I think there is an alternative there, but it's not as important as heating in terms of emissions. But I don't have a number in front of me. I can dig one up if that's what's needed.
A question from Rebecca Warren, a nice simple one, but that might get some views, some differing views. Is hydrogen safe to use in home boilers?
We wouldn't be able to use the same boilers that we have today. We would need to install a hydrogen boiler. These have been developed as in part as part of the Hy4Heat program, so those are available. And there's also looking at developing what I think Richard alluded to, either hydrogen ready boiler. So that's a boiler that works with natural gas, but then sort of you replace a component and then it will work with hydrogen, or a dual fuel boiler that can work with both type of fuels, but probably with a reduced efficiency, probably to one of them.
So the question though is it safe?
So the boiler itself is just the combustion, so it should be similar to a gas boiler. We do have also potentially, because the hydrogen burns a bit higher additional NOx, but obviously that goes is now within the home, and hopefully through the design of the boiler itself, that should be kept into a similar level as the current gas boilers.
It's not. The issue is how explosive is hydrogen, and then if there is a leak, how quickly does it disperse? So if you have a room filled with hydrogen, it would make a bigger bang than a room filled with methane. That's, you know, we know that already. That's fairly easy to work out. Interestingly, there's been some analysis done on a project called High House, where it wasn't quite as exciting as opening up a tap and throwing a match into the front door, which they wanted to do initially. It monitored the leakage rates in the house for effectively putting some hydrogen into the house. And what that showed was that if there was a leak, because hydrogen is less dense, it would dissipate more quickly than methane would. So while it might be more explosive, it would dissipate more quickly. So the risk of there being a leak and then an explosion actually is about the same as with a gas boiler. I guess the bigger point is, in 100 years, will we be looking back thinking we were mad for pumping in a gas into our house in the first place? Particularly, I think, around some of the air pollution issues and NOx that we've talked about already.
Yeah, just on the safety issue, I would of course say that this is something that's being carefully assessed. So it's not as if hydrogen boilers are going to be installed and we'll wait and see if they explode. So the Health and Safety Executive is currently undertaking trials of all these technologies to evaluate their safety and to provide the appropriate certification. I think if there is an issue, it's actually less the boilers, it's potentially the very last part of the pipe connection into homes, where there's a potential gap between the distribution network replacement that's been going on and the final bit that gets basically the gas to your boiler. There's basically, we don't entirely know exactly what all the little bits of gas pipelines are that go into people's homes. And that's, I think, where the issue is more likely to lie.
I have another question now from James Livingstone. Won't the cost of electricity and heating hoses with heat pumps be much higher than heating with gas, particularly with the amount of infrastructure investment required? Will this result in greater fuel poverty and more underheated homes rather than less?
It's an important question, because the equity implications of moving away from gas could be huge in any pathway. And Richard mentioned, the cost estimates for hydrogen, which are deeply uncertain. Richard mentioned a figure of 8 pence per kilowatt hour, which is almost 3 times or even more than 3 times than the price of gas. So, whether it's a hydrogen pathway or an electrification pathway, we run into those considerations pretty quickly. But I would take some issue, I guess, with the statement that it's necessarily more expensive to heat using a heat pump. In fact, if you use your heat pump smartly already today, you can lower your bills. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. We've reduced our energy bills by about half since we switched to a heat pump. And that's despite electricity generally being more expensive. But by being on a variable tariff, which changes during peak hours, is more expensive and lower during the night hours, for example, you can run your heat pump in such a way that you take advantage of that. And we need to make sure that especially people on low incomes are enabled to do that in a way that provides the same level of comfort, but also gives them the savings and the benefits that those savings offer them. So I think it's critical, and how we share out the costs of transitioning away will be crucial. So I believe, especially for the lowest income customers, there will need to be very sizable financial programs in place, because they simply do not have the capital to make the investments themselves. And of course, the cost of infrastructure, as always, need to be socialized across the entire customer base, which is the case for any technology that's being developed and built, including power plants and transmission lines and the distribution system.
I think this is where the heat network part becomes very important. So essentially, if we're looking to target social issues and fuel poverty, we're often looking at areas of social housing that are probably the best locations to be installing heat networks on a local basis. And one of the advantages of that is that we can install those networks now using natural gas CHP that doesn't necessarily reduce emissions, but reduces potentially fuel costs and improves quality of life and living conditions for those in fuel poverty. So we tackled the social issues first, but by then having heat network in place, that unlocks the potential later on to fuel switch, move over to hydrogen or large scale heat pumps once we have a clearer picture of what's going to happen on the supply side.
The network that was mentioned by Mark Hewitt earlier is one of its advantages is that the heat pumps that have been installed there work in parallel with the existing gas system, and they've been installed in the existing gas rooms, so that they have had no impact, no disruption at all to the university. In fact, that was a requirement from the Vice Chancellor to make sure that didn't happen, and nobody's basically noticed, and I've sat in the building and noticed no change. So the fact that those high temperature heat pumps can work in parallel with the existing gas boilers, I think is really useful for heat networks, and they're being installed currently. Southwark is starting to look at doing that, and it's a really good way to get to a lot of people who a lot of council housing is on heat networks, small scale heat networks, and it's a good way forward in my view.
A question from Abigail Dombey to Jan. I'd be interested to hear more about the impact of your home retrofit.
It's not been easy. Let me be completely honest, because there isn't a ready-made supply chain where when you need a new bathroom or a new kitchen, you can walk into a store and you get one-stop shop service. Ideally they manage everything for you. With a retrofit, that's currently not the case. You have to piece different bits together, and you need to find good installers and make sure they work in tandem. And that takes time and effort, and not everybody is willing to do that. But I have to say the results of the insulation of having triple glazed windows and having a heat pump are just phenomenal. I mean, we always lived in fairly leaky homes in the UK. Having moved here from Germany 15 years ago, I know what comfortable homes here can look like, but I've gotten used to fairly drafty Victorian terraces in Oxford and in London. We now have a home that is very comfortable, is always warm, but our bills are lower, and it emits 70% less carbon. So the impacts have been great, and I'm happy to share the results in there's a detailed write-up I've produced and published last year on the impacts in much more detail, which I can share in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jan. And that leads me to the next question, which is from Steve Adams. This general question to the panel. There's a compelling case for heat pumps, but how do heat pumps rebrand themselves to become more attractive to consumers? Because everyone can grasp the idea of burning a cleaner fuel, like hydrogen, in their boilers, but they cannot get their heads around the alchemy of heat pumps. What can be done from a PR perspective to turn this round?
So my parents live in the rural part of Scotland, off the gas grid, burn fuel oil for heating, but very environmentally minded, open to ideas. So I pushed them towards installing a heat pump a few years ago. They went along with this, installed one, had a very bad experience. It broke down almost straight away. They couldn't get anyone to repair it. It kept on failing. 2 years later, they took it out again. So the customer experience of heat pumps seems to have been pretty poor so far. And it's quite hard to push people towards it when they already have this very good, convenient, although carbon emitting solution in their homes. I think the solution is when you start to integrate with time-based energy tariffs. So there's, for example, an energy supplier out there who will now give you negative prices for energy. At the moment, it's incredibly small prices. You get very, very little money from it. But that's a huge publicity and marketing tool. You could get essentially free electricity or even get paid to use electricity to heat your home. And those numbers will change in the future when we have more and more variable renewable energy on the system. I think that is the key selling point. You can have free or even get paid to use energy.
But I think that's a great point about tariffs. But I do think that the heat pump industry does need to present a more attractive offer, both in terms of the product and in terms of the service. So I think that is work which is very much underway and must be done, obviously, to bring people along with us. But what I would say is that it's interesting how important this question of if we talk about the residential scale, how important the question of the desirability of the objects remains in a consumer context. So nobody cares what their boiler looks like, but I think that people do have to care what their heat pumps are going to look like, and that's part of, in a way, the opportunity for heat pumps. And if you look at sort of the battery market and how successful Tesla have been with their Powerwall, which I'm not sure it has an enormous number of differentiators with competitors, but it is selling at a very high rate, and I think a lot of that is to do with its kind of visual desirability. And in a way, I think there's a kind of secret opportunity there that people could get excited about this technology in the way that I think you can't be excited about a gas boiler, really.
So I do agree with Mark, and the Tesla badge has been an incredibly powerful thing for batteries that really offer no actual value to a household. In fact, they tend to be a cost rather than add value. There are lots of good things to like about heat pumps, And it's a real communication challenge that I think the energy industry and the heat pump manufacturers need to, they need a kick, really, because there's nothing fancy about heat pumps. They just need to be done well and done properly. And I'm really sad to hear about Graeme's case, because I've heard about it before. But we're in an unfortunate situation, where we've had a policy failure over the past decade from the RHI that hasn't grown the market to a level which it was expected to be at. And because of that, I'm having to get a service engineer to service my heat pump to drive 2 hours to get to my house. And I might be in Cornwall, but there are a lot of houses in Cornwall not on the gas grid. And so really, it's a market issue, and I think it can be solved. And once everything is sort of reflected in the policy and in the market, it should naturally flourish, and people will be arguing over heat pumps like engineers currently argue over what the best gas boiler is. It's very much a scale issue.
Just to quickly add to that, and I think part of the solution to this is deploying heat pumps in those low regret sites like new build, which are well insulated and efficient and would work perfectly. And like that, we steadily managed to increase the supply chain, have more manufacturing on the market, have more installers, more maintenance, and that sort of will help build that confidence even for retrofit.
Thank you. And then my penultimate question, I'm going to just bunch a few together. I've had comments here that with millions of heat pumps potentially drawing energy from the air, is there a knock-on effect on winter air temperature? And somebody else saying, is with so many ground source heat pumps in the earth, is it going to make the earth freeze? So what is the effect of multiple installations in the context of temperature of earth and air from which the heat will be drawn?
I can't answer the question about how we attack the temperature of the air in the world, but I have a strong feeling we won't notice much difference, and we are trying to cool things down. I can talk about the way you draw heat in and out of the ground, however. I've been involved for quite a long time with Dutch aquifer thermal energy storage systems, and there is what we're talking about there is the advantage of cooling, if you like. We're bringing in cooling, and when you cool, you dump heat into the ground, and then you take the same heat back out again in the winter to heat the building. So you actually get a benefit, and there's several thousand large-scale aquifer thermal energy storage systems running in the Holland these days, and that is they are required by the Environment Agency equivalent, and indeed the Environment Agency here requires you to balance out the temperatures that you're doing and monitors the temperature changes. Oh, my son is ringing me up at the most inconvenient moment. And anyway, so I think large scale, one of the advantages is actually using cooling of buildings to offset the heating demand in the winter. So you get interseasonal heat transfer. That is really helpful. I don't think that necessarily answers the question completely, but it's an attempt anyway.
Just a quick follow on from Andy's point. The Dutch example, where they require thermal balance across the year, is very interesting as a result of the very detailed hydrogeological engineering standards that they have there. In London, for example, we have a rather different scenario where we have rising temperatures in the aquifer, which is a significant concern to the Environment Agency. So, because when temperatures get too high, then you get microbial issues in the aquifer. So they're very keen on heating biased heat pump schemes, which abstract heat from the aquifer at the moment, because apart from kind of the influence of climate change, we're also seeing the influence of localized heat rejection into the London aquifer through cooling schemes. So I think we're talking about an enormous thermal resource here. So I don't think we need to panic too much. Certainly the airstream is not an issue. We are not in danger of kind of causing local freezing. But the question that there is a point theoretically where if you use ground source only from closed loop rather than from aquifer in a very dense urban situation, then you'd have to kind of, you'd have to model to make sure that you were not going to create a sort of a significant ground cooling over time, a chronic ground cooling issue. So, but it would be a rather specific problem related to incredibly dense urban closed loop solution. So that's a bit of a nerdy answer.
To add that was, I would love to see millions and millions of ground source heat pumps, given how efficient and good they are. I would imagine in the UK probably would be a predominantly air source heat pump probably that they will be deployed rather than the ground source heat pump.
Thank you. And then the final question is, again, consolidating from many people. We are starting to see what is right. We know that upstream we should be doing certain things that, you know, upstream from us. How do we convince the governments? And the panel all seem to be agreed on hydrogen. How do we convince the governments to do the right thing?
The government, this is part of it, actually. We need to get our act together. We need to, as an industry, say that's what we want to do, and we need to promote openness in terms of large-scale demonstrations, so we can see exactly what happens. Then we can plan a path forward.
Pippa, I think you're muted, but I guess I'm next. So I think the government has actually, I think, understood that clearly, you know, energy efficiency and heat pumps will have to play a major role, and we have targets for that. And the Climate Change Committee have just pointed out again in their last report just before Christmas how important it is to make inroads to meet those targets. And for hydrogen, we have a pilot project that's being planned, but that's not going to get up to any sort of scale before the end of this decade. And by then we will have much better data on, you know, how viable that actually is as a solution. I think in the meantime, what government needs to do is really to crack on meeting those targets, because we can't wait another decade until we roll out low carbon heat and insulate our buildings. So we really got to get going, and current policies are simply not good enough. You know, we need to really get to grips with existing policies and get something that delivers a step change.
So I think a bit that Jan was saying that particularly the Department of Energy, they are looking across the board. They're looking at hydrogen solutions and also electrification. And I think it's also down to the industry for us to implement the right solutions and to highlight where we think they're critical items, where we think that the technology needs to be pushed more and to have more support from government, and where, for example, we're lacking either the skills or the workforce.
Thank you. Now, Graeme, I believe.
I think there is one issue that perhaps the Westminster could learn a bit more from the Scottish government, and that is to not just look at the carbon benefits. There's a huge amount of co-benefits that come from improving the quality of domestic heating in the UK. We have very poor housing stock, we have a lot of fuel poverty, and a lot of health issues that come out of this. And a strategy that kind of encompasses all of those benefits alongside decarbonisation actually looks a lot more economically favourable than one that just looks at carbonisation on its own.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I'd just like to push a little bit on this point, because I think that, you know, the UK has a bit of a habit of driving itself up a blind alley. And, you know, we saw this with the RHI and that absurd biomass kind of nonsense, which I'm not sure was entirely accidental. And I just think that more people need to read papers like Richard's and actually understand that there is an enormous vested interest here in driving towards towards hydrogen. And I'm not saying that there isn't significant technical benefits for deploying hydrogen, in fact, quite the reverse. But I do think that policy has to be driven by analysis and science. And in this case, I think we have to be very alert to the risk of policy, this incredibly important policy decision, which we cannot afford to get wrong again, being driven by problematic vested interest.
Thank you very much, Mark. Richard.
Thanks, Pippa. So I'll say two things. I'll start with a negative one, which can be made positive. So I think Mark's right. And the invisibility of lobbying in the UK means that it's very difficult to know what's going on and to study it. But it is a lot. And I saw a really interesting comment the other day that said, if you had X billion pounds to spend on energy, what would it be on? And a really good answer to that question was lobbying. And not all of us see ourselves as lobbyists, but there is a huge thing to fight. And if you can just invest some time or effort, whether you're a company or an individual, and clearly plenty of people are already doing this in their own time through things like Extinction Rebellion. But if you can just spend some time communicating with your local MP or contacting the relevant minister, even as an individual, you can have an impact. And it will just be taking that little bit off what is coming from the corporate side. And I'm not 100% against corporate lobbying and information sharing, but it needs to be balanced, and it's clearly not transparent. And then the positive thing is that everyone needs to realise and I agree with Graeme on this, there are huge co-benefits from heat decarbonisation. And it looks like heat decarbonisation will cost some money, which we know it will. But actually, I think if you look at the bigger sort of macro picture, when we're talking about reducing oil and gas imports, it totally flips it around. And when we're talking about more comfortable homes, those things aren't valued either. And so rather than just focusing on the costs and the difficulties, and even if it looks very difficult to meet the 2050 target, just always bear in mind lots of good stuff and lots of co-benefits can be produced at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. We know that good, clean energy brings life benefits and people flourish and prosper. And I've just had somebody say, well said, Richard. And lots of positive comments coming through. We're going to have to call it a day. I know we could do another hour easily on these questions. It's just never long enough. But people do have homes to go to, or they probably maybe already be in them. So we'll just move to Andy in a moment to wrap up. Before we go, I want to remind everybody our next event is on Thursday, the 22nd of April, which is Earth Day. Therefore, we have titled our next big event, our climate emergency event, How on Earth? And we're going to be looking at how on earth we as a sector project manage the massive changes to the building fabric and heat to respond to the climate emergency and all these targets for decarbonisation. It is a massive, massive venture, and we want to start looking at the logistics of how we do that. I feel daunted just reading out the title, never mind getting down to the job and doing it across the sector. But join us on Thursday the 22nd on Earth Day. We will be in touch with you with lots more information. And now I'm going to hand you over to Andy, and just one last thing, a big thanks to the panelists. They give a 10-minute presentation, but they do so much work behind the scenes. We've had conversations, we've frequent communications, they prepare their presentations. We discuss not just each of the talks, but all collectively, so that we're presenting something cohesive and meaningful that you can take back into your working lives and act on, which is very important. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you for being patient with us. and being here today. And I am now going to pass you, and I'm having one from, thanks to all the panelists, from the speakers, loads and loads of thanks coming in. And over now to Andy Ford to wrap up and summarise what we might have heard today. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Pippa. And I'm going to add my thanks to all the panelists. That was really excellent. And thanks to all those of you who are still participating. It's very good to see so many hanging in for such a long time. It's a really important issue, this, which has taken a long time to come to the fore. And I'm going to just summarise. I think the first thing I would say is that Jan's point is it's going to be deeply personal. Yeah, we're all going to be engaged in this. I don't care who you are, what you do, you are going to be part of this discussion because it's got to happen to us all. And there is amazingly low awareness at the moment. And that's dangerous because that comment around the uncertainty and large-scale ambitions from people already bedded in various industries means that they can get on and push hard very early before anybody really gets their understanding there. There is lots to be done. There is a lot to be done to make sure this is an equitable transition and those people who are poor don't get shoved to one side. I live in a Victorian house and I built a large extension on it, built to super insulated standards. I live there now. I don't like going in the other bit. It's cold. To be honest, the excuses for building new homes, which are not very comfortable with next to no heating, have gone. There are none. Our old homes could also become that. That is a separate and parallel phase that has to take place over the next 30 years. The heating, I think this discussion about hydrogen has been fascinating. 8p an hour, maybe it's about time we started shifting some of the load for decarbonising energy from electricity onto gas, because they've got away with it for too long and they now need to decarbonise, so it should be them who are paying. Unfortunately, I feel that might end up on us, and that's a challenge for our government. So thank you all. I want to see a more localised energy system personally, but that's just me. I think there's lots of advantages with demand-side response and getting some benefit from our energy system. We're the demand side, all of us. It's about time we spoke together. So if I can finish with that and say, please come to the next one. We haven't finished yet. Thank you.